Hi, everybody. My name is Stéphane Gerson. I'm a historian of modern France at NYU, and I'm honored to moderate this conversation around Dominique Kalifa. Dominique was a longtime friend. He was a historian whose work mattered to me, and as it did to many others. And he was a dear colleague who I got to know well in Paris, and especially New York. He taught for us twice at NYU's IFS, Institute of French Studies. As academics, we come together for many different reasons. Sometimes we come together to exchange ideas. Sometimes we come together to assess the scholarship of others. And sometimes we come together in rituals that mark a scholar's passage from one institutional grade to another. And other times we come together to mourn a colleague and to express our loss, and also to express our gratitude, our appreciation for what this colleague has given us over the years. And clearly today, this is why we're here. We're here today to, all four of us, but also all of you who are joining us in many countries, no doubt. We're here to mourn Dominique Kalifa, and we're here to commemorate him, but also to talk about his work and his institutional presence in many academic fields. Dominique died on September 12th, 2020. It was the day of his 63rd birthday. He died abruptly, unexpectedly, and leaving us all dumbfounded in shock, I think. And the reactions to his death on private messages in the media and in social media bore witness to his presence within many fields and across borders, and they bore witness to the depth and the reach of his work. In France, some scholars came together in the Cours de la Sorbonne for his ceremony, but most of us could not attend. And for this reason, and also to capture the international reach of Dominique's work and presence, H France asked Vinny Dada and Robin Waltz and myself to organize a forum in honor of him. And from the start, the three of us decided that in addition to a series of written essays that are now available online, this forum would include a conversation that would serve as a kind of makeshift ritual, making room for both emotion and intellectual reflection. And so I want to thank the people who made this event possible, Robin and Vinny, whom I am representing as the moderator today, David Smith and Patrick Bray and Maureen McLeod from H France, and Maureen handled all the logistics for this event, so a special thank you to her. And most of all, to our three speakers. And all three of you, Mom and John and Miranda, all three of you told me how difficult and also how important it is to participate in this conversation. And I think I can share Mom's words in an email. Je suis à la fois heureuse de participer à ce moment et encore triste, stupéfaite de l'occasion qui nous réunit. So thank you to all three of you for being here today. John, you told me in one email that Dominique's range was simply extraordinary. And for this reason, the three of you represent different generations and different fields and different disciplines, but also different locations. You're based in the US as well as France. You met and interacted with Dominique and with his work in different ways. And so the insights that you'll bring to this conversation will capture different facets of Dominique's presence and contribution. And they will complement the essays that come from scholars from France and the US and Canada. Now, we could have imagined a more ambitious event with scholars from other disciplines and other parts of the world. And we know that Dominique spent much time also in the UK and South America. But there'll be other opportunities, I know, to speak about all this. So let me briefly introduce the three of you, and then we'll move on to a conversation that will last about 60, maybe 70 minutes. Mame-Fatou Niang, you're a French-born scholar, a photographer, a filmmaker. You teach at Carnegie Mellon. You're an associate professor of French and Francophone studies, and you're presently in France. And you're working on a book, tentatively called Mosaica Negra, Blackness in 21st Century France. Miranda Spieler, you're a historian of France and the overseas empire. You work notably in Guyana. You're an associate professor at the American University in Paris. So you live and you work in France. And your current research explores the stories of people of color in Paris and port cities during the 18th century. John Merriman, you're a historian of modern French and European history at Yale. You have written, edited countless books. You're currently working on the Milice, I believe. And in non-COVID times, you live in France much of the time, though you're joining us from New Haven today. And so while I will moderate this conversation, I also hope that's going to prove spontaneous and that the three of you will speak to one another and bounce off ideas with one another, respond to what others have said about Dominique as a scholar, as a person, as a professor, as a mentor, and as an institutional figure who played a big role in our profession. So to prepare this roundtable, I had preliminary conversations with each one of you. And all three of you had a lot to say about his scholarship, and we'll devote a lot of time to talk about his scholarship. But you also spoke about Dominique as a person. And interestingly, each one of you emphasized beyond, again, his intellectual qualities, each one of you emphasized a different aspect of his personality. And so I'd like to start by asking you in turn to speak about that facet of his personality. And I'll start with you, Mame. What you emphasized when we spoke was Dominique's écoute, his ability to listen, his regard for others. And you said that this is something that was apparent to you and pivotal from the start of your relationship, from the first time you met him, and I gather that you met him through your cousin, who had him as a high school student. So could you tell us more about this, and also what his écoute meant to you in your own career?
So yes, I mean, before the story with Dominique, the friendship and intellectual companionage, I have this, yes, like funny, cute prehistory with him. I first heard of him, like you say, at the beginning of the 90s. I was barely in my teens, and he was my cousin's history teacher at Jules Uri in Creil. And there was a real buzz around in the neighborhood around this young guy who kind of stood out in the middle of other professors. And when the news of Dominique's transition broke out, some of these lycéens from 30 years ago recalled that, and I'm paraphrasing my cousin, that he was one of the few professors who listened. He was one of the few who cared about what those kids had to say. That's what people remembered about him. And many years later, I met him again at a seminar in Paris through my cousin, who would become his student. And in true Dominique fashion, we found ourselves at a restaurant nearby with a small group of attendees. I was fresh out of Cannes and frankly lost at what the university and literary studies could do for me. I had been at the time repeatedly discouraged to pursues, my exploration on the journalistic gaze's impact on the production of the banlieue imaginary in the 21st century. And he immediately became a model, a teacher, an advisor, a friend. And he was generous with his time, and he suggested paths. He listened, and he taught me to listen. He opened doors. He facilitated invitations to colloquiums, seminars. And for me, at the time, I was a pure product of a French elite system with this top-down and very rigid class system, where I was often made aware of my status as a young, Black female researcher from a working class background. And everything about this relationship was novel. And with University of Lyon 2's professors, Claudette Fillard, Dominique was absolutely instrumental in guiding me to spread my wings and fly across the big ponds toward my dream, a PhD in the US. And I like to think of him like that, the passeur who helped smuggle me in the US.
Well, this metaphor of the passeur comes across in one of the articles in the forum, and we'll talk more about it a little later. But what you're saying about Dominique as a mentor also echoes Mélanie Simard-Oud's essay. She was, his student as well, and she writes in her piece. She writes about his confiance et bienveillance towards younger scholars. Il savait comme nul autre aiguillonner les jeunes chercheurs qui dirigeaient sur la bonne voie. It very much echoes your own experience. John, you met Dominique later than Mame. You met him, I think, in the early aughts, and you were introduced by Michel Perrault and Alain Corbin, and you became a close friend. And the quality you emphasized when we spoke was his wide-ranging curiosity for people and for historical questions in fields study. Could you speak about that in his work and your relationship?
Well, I will in a minute, but I'd like to say something about, first, Dominique as a person. And yes, I met Dominique through Alain Corbin, and especially Michel Perrault, who said, il faut absolument que tu fasses la connaissance de Kalifa. And this was 20 years ago, or maybe a little more. And Corbin and my son Chris, who was 11 then, and I were supposed to meet him in a resto on the Rue Cujas in the 5e. And Corbin couldn't come, he had trouble getting around. And so that's where I met Kalifa, and we became good friends. And he meant a lot to me. He was a friend of my late wife. My wife passed away 4 years ago, and Dominique knew her, quite well. And it's hard for me to do this. It's very close to my kids, and I was lucky enough to get this big Lifetime Achievement Award from the AHA or something, which meant I had to go to conferences, and I hate conferences like that. But I had to go, and Dominique, he flew across the Atlantic to DC to be there with me when I got this award. And just on another personal note, it's more personal and professional, but I'd like to talk about that later, because a lot of the books that I wrote, were in a way influenced by Dominique. But when my wife passed away, Dominique was frequently in Balazouk, where we lived. He loved Cure à de Choix, which is a Chardonnay with liqueur de Champagne. And I made sure when I bring back a bottle of liqueur de Champagne here in Connecticut, in North Haven, Connecticut. So when Kalifa came, I could give him a Cure à de Choix. But after my wife passed away, he came down to Balazouk, and he didn't want me to go to the notaire, to sign the final papers, a sad moment, and drink the Armagnac afterward, the nearest cafe alone. So he came down to Balazouk, and, Kalifa était comme ça. And that was it. And he's real close to my kids, as he was to Carol, my late wife. And, I visited him in, he was born in Vichy, but he had a house where in which he disappeared, that I visited them a year and a half ago, right near Vichy. And I'm now writing a book on La Milice, and the topic, I'd been to Vichy before, and it's not a place you want to hang out a lot. Mm-hmm. But I went to Vichy to see Dominique, and we passed a nice gastronomic weekend at his house, and is walking around Vichy again with Dominique, that the idea of doing a book on La Milice came. He told me about a book which I subsequently read immediately, called by another person from Vichy, called Audrey Mallet, called Vichy contre Vichy. And so I read the book, and so the idea of the book came from this time. But so, I'm talking more about personal connections with Dominique, but that was really so important, in my life and that of my family. And the academic connections, were essential. And I'd like to talk about those later. That was enough on that.
You told me that that when he came to visit you, this curiosity that you mentioned, you saw it, like the ways he would interact with people, in the cafe, and just being open to everybody he met, and
absolutely.
Elsewhere. And also to how he would get up in the morning and was working so hard, just trying to learn. That's the way you framed it, just learning.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you, 2 examples. When he came to Yale a couple times, so he gave a talk in the French department and gave a talk in the history department. He was interested in everything and everybody. And he asked questions, and he learned from them as they learned from him. And then when he went to Balazouk, we've lived since 1987 in Balazouk, and my kids were in school often in Balazouk, classe primaire, classe unique. But he's not just interested in academics. When we go up to the cafe, and we go to the cafe a lot, he would ask people what they're interested in. He would talk to them, and there's no academics live in Balazouk. A couple people now have houses there that come once in a while because they met us. But it's a place where my best friends live in Balazouk, and they have nothing to do with the academic world in which we inhabit. And he asked questions to them too. He wanted to know their interests. He wanted to know how they felt about living in a village that's paumé la plupart de l'année, but that's just overrun with the tourist hordes in the summer. And he was interested in everybody, and he learned from all sorts of people. And this was his just great intellectual curiosity, and it went far beyond the kind of academic stuff that the four of us, do. So, that was it. I mean, he just was curious. And about his work habits, when I went and stayed with them in August of 2019, I'd be kind of sleeping off all the wine that we had the night before. and I'd kind of walk down the stairs, clutching the railing on the stairs at about 8:30. And Kalifa, Dominique had been writing book reviews since 5 in the morning. 5 in the effing morning, because he wrote so many reviews for Libé. I mean, how many? 150 reviews for Libé. There's some site which I couldn't get onto. You can read them all. I mean, reviewed my books on Libé, reviewed everybody in Libé, I mean, il a travaillé tout le temps. It just he just had, and part of it was the curiosity thing, the Stéphane that you evoked, because he was curious about everything. He read everything. He asked everybody questions, and
Mom,
he wrote reviews.
Were you going to say
everything.
something?
That's him, workaholic.
Miranda, your relationship with Dominique began a dozen years ago at a conference in the U.S., and then you weren't intimate friends, but you interacted with him on panels and on a forum about your book, Empire and Underworld, and he invited you to a thesis defense. And one of the qualities that you mentioned when we spoke was his playfulness and the performativity that accompanied his rigor. And this is also mentioned in André Goulet's piece. She speaks, I quote, of the zest for movement, activity, and constant discovery that came through in everything Dominique did, whether he was traveling the globe or entertaining local audiences in the cabaret-like space of the Théâtre de Nesle. Rather than leave us in the muck of the underworld, Dominique gave us access to its flip side. He chose the performativity and playfulness of a joyful cabaret. And I believe that when he introduced himself to you, he told you he was an actor.
And I said, first of all, I'd love to see you when you're performing, but I didn't really get an invitation after that. However, I am profoundly indebted to him, because when I decided to make this really kind of difficult life choice and move with my baby by myself, friends, he was very helpful to me in the sense that, it mattered that Dominique decided to be on a book forum for me, an obscure person, unknown to the academics here. And so that was a gratuitous act of kindness, really. He didn't have to do that. He had there's nothing he gained from it, because I was, starting out, really. And I guess I feel profoundly indebted to him. And I think that his life was characterized by these gratuitous acts of generosity that were unseen by other people. And I noticed that even by the master's thesis he agreed to direct Americans who were in town. I think that he was extraordinarily suave, so you wouldn't exactly imagine kind-hearted, giving man, but that was my experience, and I think it's experience everyone. It's true that was completely plausible to me that he was an actor when I had them, but he never seemed like he was acting when I was talking.
It reminds me of Robin Waltz in his piece on Fantomas. I think that when Robin met him, he introduced himself as a président de la Société des Amis de Fantomas. So his ability to exist in multiple worlds and to connect multiple worlds, I think connected to this kindness and generosity that all of you just mentioned, I think gave him a specific place within our profession. And we'll come back to that a little bit later.
He introduced himself as an improv performer.
Improv performer, okay. Let's talk about certain aspects of his work. I mean, clearly we won't have time, to talk about all facets of his scholarship. But there are a couple points that we should talk about. Dominique returned again and again to what he called les envers de la société du dessus. He was not the first or the only scholar to excavate this world. I mean, we can think of Michel Perrault, Michel Foucault, Arlette Farge, Philippe Artière, and others. But he made it his own. And regarding les bas-fonds, he wrote, il convient d'entrer sans frémir ni reculer dans ce monde sous un monde qu'évoquaient les Goncourt. And I think this is what Dominique did, right? Il est entré sans frémir ni reculer. In her piece, Marie-Ève Ferranti emphasized this commitment to what she calls les histoires minorées, déviantes, marginalisées, ces affaires anonymes et souvent sans épaisseur qui racontent à la société ces transgressions quotidiennes. I'm eager to hear what his commitment and his empathy for les bas-fonds in his work signifies to you. I mean, maybe, yes, go ahead, Mame.
I can start.
Yeah.
Well, L'encre et le sang and les bas-fonds were among actually my first introductions to the history of social imaginaries and to perspectives that were completely foreign to the students in literary studies that I was at the time. I mean, we're talking 2004, 2005, and in that 2007, sorry. And in that sense, my story eerie parallels, that of scholars like Mellon and many others who were baked in this cloisonnement between disciplines, between the humanities and social sciences, and for whom Dominique opened a whole new world of languages, methods, and perspectives. For example, he closely read and advised me for my dissertation on la fabrique médiatique de la banlieue to the publication of my first book, Identité Française, which heavily borrows from his cross readings of history and literature and his investigation of our societies, of France's need to consume representations of vice from its banlieue. And speaking of that, fascination for l'envers, I learned from him that it was okay to be attracted to the blind spots of society. I mean, after all, he is an example that you could be successful in academia while looking at the déclassés, while looking at the losers, while exploring the darker corners of society and of mankind, the ones that nobody wants to talk about, or the ones that are only talked about in bad terms. And from there, be ready to rethink the contribution of what we call the margins. And as a specialist of the banlieue, I completely immerse myself in his work on the Apache, for example. His way of showing that in history, you also have life, you have beats, you have soul, you have emotion, you have encounters, and all that made a matière vivante and palpitante, and that we had to learn. We had to allow ourselves to listen to this matter. And yeah, so he encouraged me to learn how to listen, going back to your first question, how to listen to unlikely sources, how to unsilence what's muted, how to make archives more talkative than they seem, how to trust my intuitions, And I was very, very intrigued by his approach of, to the history of crime, not focusing on the crime itself, but on the way it's recalled in popular culture and the way that impacted our, the memory that we had of places, to take away the focus from the crimes and criminals and look at the matter in which we spoke of these, kind of this reverse and say what that say about society's fears, desires, dreams, and aspiration, as Marie-Fatou puts it. Yeah, that is Dominique.
Well, I had always been, I was a student of yet another late friend, Chuck Tilley, a great sociologist and historian, who passed away in 2008. And he once said memorably, "It's bitter hard to write the history of remainders, of those folks left behind." And I guess being, in a way, kind of a marginal character myself, that's how I felt at Yale in the first part of the decades I've taught at this place, but no longer feel that way. And I was writing about people who were les exclus, who were marginal. Hommage la Ville, one of my books, or Les Mots à Ville Rouge, another one. But his work sort of pulling together the representations of the excluded. Les Apaches, Michel worked on Les Apaches also, and the banlieue, and the realities of these people that you see, surtout in Les Bas-Fonds, had an influence on a couple of my recent books, on Massacre, which is it's an earlier period. It's on, La Commune, La Semaine Sanglante, in Paris in 1871. And especially a book that was really about why the Belle Époque didn't exist. The book I wrote, I can't remember the title now, the Ballad of the Anarchist Bandits, which is about Victor Kilbatich and Rirette Maître Jean and the anarchists. And most anarchists weren't terrorists. I wrote about the one who was when I wrote Dynamite Club, and that was a different kind of book. But in that book, I could play kind of off in a Dominique way the juxtaposition between representations and reality. And he was so interested in that, and that influenced, influenced my thinking in that book too. I mean, he wrote. We had a lot of similar interests, and he did most of them a lot better than I did. But I did a book a long time ago on the commissaire de police, and he wrote about so different things, and I'd forgotten that I was at a conference in which Dominique helped organize on les commissaires de police, and he edited the book on les commissaires de police. I mean, he knew so much. And again, the idea of Dominique comme passeur, he went to Texas, to UT once, to give a talk down there. My former student and dear friend Judy Coffin teaches down there. And she said he was just amazing. That's the same thing. He was helping everybody. What do you work on? What do you think about that? Is there anything I can help you? If you come to Paris, please let me know. I can, put you in touch with, X or Y. And that's the way he was. I mean, his academic, his intellectual influence was just enormous. I regret I never saw him, perform in a play. He did that. That's one of the reasons he did that, was to improve his English. Mm-hmm. I never got to do that, and I regret that very much. Anyway, I just go on and on, but his influence on me and my family and my students and my friends was just enormous. And what a great historian! Qu'est-ce qu'il était bien, voilà.
Est-ce qu'il est bien?
Miranda.
Really bien.
Miranda, should I show the passage that you?
You can show it. We can
go ahead.
What I was going to say. I mean, first, I just wanted to bounce off of something interesting that John just pointed out, which has to do with the relationship between representation and reality. Because I'm convinced when you read Dominique, that really there's nothing but the cave. I mean, there is no way that you can disengage truth from representation. And I think the whole structure of the way he created the imaginary is about that. And he states it pretty explicitly that those are not possible to disentangle. And this becomes really dark in a lot of places in his work. I'm thinking, I gave Stéphane a quotation about bodies in Berribi, right, where people are feigning, attempting to misrepresent their bodies as sick, but in the process of misrepresenting their bodies as sick, they are mutilating themselves and blinding themselves. And it's just an example of how something as frank and bare as the body is entangled with representations. And I also want to say that while I'm so struck and moved by these descriptions of his generosity as a person, and I felt that very strongly myself. But I'm also struck by the fact that the social imaginary that he articulates takes us to a very dark place. Yes. And it's really at the edge of human monstrosity. And he really, even though I'm talking about the entanglement of representation and reality, this being inseparable, he takes us to a place where we confront a sort of monstrous version of human, and then are embarrassed by our own repugnance. And this sort of, I think it's a deliberate maneuver, but his exploration is that of alterity, right? And although he really didn't write about race in an explicit way, comes up in little places, he writes about the construction of alterity in ways in which I'm tempted to say he's talking about the construction of race within French society itself.
Absolutely. I mean, and I couldn't agree more about what you say. And I really like how you put it, the fact that he's taking us to the edge. But, in the past year, especially on his work around Berribi, I like to see this edge as a bridge, or, using again the metaphor of the passeur as a bâton de relais that he's giving to a next generation of historians or next generation of scholars of race in France, the way he's unveiling this, this amnesia around this history. And it's like it's either, we can see it as either unveiling half of it and giving us to us, now that we've been, mis en appétit, unveil what's behind the curtain, or putting us to the edge, and maybe putting us in charge of wanting to see more, wanting to dig more. I mean, Biribi has been one of my first exposition to colonial history, and we can talk about it later, and I absolutely see it as a bâton de relais.
Well, let's talk about it now, because actually the essays talk less about Biribi than they do about some of the other books, and some scholars think that perhaps it was one of his most important book. And I'm curious, it's a book about Miranda, as you put it, it's a book about punishment, and in our conversation you emphasize that. That's something that people were not writing that much about it at the time. Punishment, but connected to the bas-fond. So there was a direct connection to his work on the metropole and on multiple metropoles. It's also work on social practices and everyday resistances and forms of embodied history. And the book is about over 12 years ago?
It's from
2009.
2009, so about 12 years ago. So I'm curious to hear where you would situate that book as you look at the historiography.
Well, one thing that's important is that I've worked in similar kinds of archives, and what's so unflinching about that book is what he's willing to look at. And it reminds me, before I went to graduate school, I worked for Susan Sontag, and she was working on a book at the time called Regarding the Pain of Others. And she had a Goya engraving next to her writing space, which she forced herself to look at. It was a monster every day. And when I read Biribi, what I think is important about it is that he is unflinching in the way he articulates what are essentially used and mutilated bodies. And he tells us that is essentially an excrescence of the urban space of France, right? Those are the people who have been projected into the colonial world from the bas-fond. This isn't another world, even though, there's this funny abstractness where Biribi, c'est en Afrique. I think that's the phrase that repeats itself. So there's an abstract relationship to the empire that's a little bit troubling. And frankly, if book were written now, I think there would be more of an engagement with what exactly these soldiers are doing, right? We don't hear about that at all. We hear about their bravura, but we never hear about how that bravura is exercising itself on the native population of North Africa. So certainly that book would be different now. But I think that it was a bold move to say, look at this excrescence of the urban space. Look at what this way of representing the rebut or the bas-fond leads to. What it leads to is basically these spaces of oblivion, right? What I found so intriguing about that, and the particularity of this excrescence, is that people who are represented as being absolutely repugnant when they are at home, upon being placed on the Algerian frontier, become magnificent, brave officers with a sort of magical quality, right? So he uncovered things about shifts in the way representations happen that I thought were really important. But for me, one of the ingenious things, I'm interested to hear what others say. I don't want to say too much, but I do think that one of the ingenious things about Dominique's understanding of the social imaginary is that it's not just a repository of images, but it also acts as a kind of agent or program for action, right? It is constituted by us, but it's also constitutive of us. And it makes us do things, right? And so in a sense, Biribi is a product of the social imaginary, which will then become itself an object of the social imaginary.
Ma'am, John, anything else about this book and its importance?
No, I don't know enough to say anything intelligent about it.
I mean, it's I sent you a passage, an extract.
Let me share that.
And also, can you maybe share it? Because it comes very tiny. It comes out very tiny on my screen.
Okay, I'll try. 1 second. So
I mean, I can read my extract. Read it out. It's very short.
Is it small like this? I'm having a struggle with making it bigger. Do you want to read it?
Yeah, I'll just read it.
Yeah.
Biribi. Ce terme a cessé de nous être familier et ne surnage guère dans la mémoire nationale que grâce au roman de Georges Darien, publié en 1890 et régulièrement réédité depuis cette date. Mais pour la plupart de nos contemporains, ce mot étrange, aux sonorités incertaines, ne signifie plus grand-chose aujourd'hui. Au mieux, une sorte de contrée oubliée et désolée, perdue quelque part en Afrique, et dont on ne sait plus très bien si elle fut réelle ou seulement imaginaire, un mirage presque. Ces hommes, qui étaient-ils et pourquoi y furent-ils envoyés? Les violences, les sévices complaisamment décrits par la littérature militante ou pittoresque, furent-ils des réalités ordinaires? Car le réel existe, comme l'écrivait Bernard le Petit, et les hommes en font trop souvent dans leur chair une expérience qui est au-delà des mots. On terminera en s'attachant à cerner, sans anachronisme, ni dolorisme, mais au plus près des expériences sensibles et personnelles, les réalités quotidiennes qui furent celles des hommes de Biribi, autre ombre de l'histoire qu'on avait jusqu'ici oubliée. So I read this book, and that Dominique described, I think at the time, as a concentré of l'armée, l'Afrique, la République, right? Le tout attaché, I think he said, environné du cliquetis des chaînes, du cliquetis des chairs. And in my documentary, my 2006 documentary, Marianne Noire, French filmmaker Alice Job recalls the importance of the book, right? And its importance as part of a body of works that complexify. And here, when I say complexify, I almost mean open new doors, right? On the way a generation of French students who were themselves products of France's colonial history. I mean, I'm part of that generation. The way we ingested the roman national. And in my film, Alice spoke of the way l'éducation nationale and a host of other, institutions de la République mythify the Third Republic and cultivate this solid amnesia on its colonial history. I had never heard of the word Biribi. I've never heard the word before I encountered it on the cover of his book. And yeah, that's Biribi, the men, the marginals, the stories that apparently left no traces, the stories that, very few academics were interested in, and something that also mirrors the apparent lack of interest for our colonial history for a long time, apparently. Because as he puts it in the book, it's something that is really kind of the fil rouge to whoever wants to listen, to whoever knows how to braconner. That's really my reading of the book, right? He's teaching us how to braconner with the archives, the prison registries, the diaries of doctors or criminologists of the time, songs, folk tales, to whoever wants to know how to braconner within those sources, then right, the reality can pop up, and that can really illuminate, this reverse of the Third Republic and make this, ombre oubliée come out of the shadow of history where they've been buried for so long. And for me, that really accompanied. I've been reading it along Ralph Michel Trouillot's Silencing the Past, and it completely illuminates my understanding of amnesia and how to silence and unsilence, part of the roman national. And yeah, that's my favorite book.
Thank you. John, earlier you talked about the influence of Dominique on your own work. And like, for instance, both of you worked on policing, on enquêteur, but in different ways. And I'm curious to hear about the kinds of conversations that you would have around those questions, or even about the issue of the state, for instance, or the way you might apprehend the state in 19th century France.
Well, let me shift that question just a little bit. We talked a lot. The most recently, when he came here, or when he was visiting us in Balazouk, about the Belle Époque, and his book, Histoire, the véritable histoire de la Belle Époque. It's going to be translated. I just did a blurb for it, and of course, my view is, of course, there wasn't a Belle Époque. I mean, you could say there was a Belle Époque for Desrins or for Marquet or whatever, but there wasn't a Belle Époque because it wasn't. These were hard times for ordinary people who were being brutalized by the police. The first rafle, they weren't as murderous as the rafle in Paris in 1942 and 43 in the Jewish quarters in the Marais or in Belleville or in Montmartre. But the first rafle, and I think it's the first use of that term, were Clemenceau's thug-like police busting into working class neighborhoods that had been identified as militant long in the collective memory by the Paris Commune and events since then, and saying up against the wall, MF, not quite like that, but let's check your papers. And, his interest in the Belle Epoque and his interest in that, well, I mean, about the book, what he says in the book, and his interest in how we get this idea of periodization and why Buffett isn't such a good idea. And my idea was not only the Belle Epoque was a much later construct, which is what he argued, but that this period wasn't belle for very many people. And those are the kinds of things that, we talked about. And as I already mentioned once, and we're walking through Vichy, we talked about Vichy pendant la guerre, quoi, autour de Vichy. And that's how I ended up with the topic on the milice, which I already said. So we always had lots of things to talk about. Yeah, we were interested in the police, but I was more interested, though I did a book on the Commissaire de Police a long time ago. It's not a very good book, called Police Stories. It's about police in earlier times, but I was more interested in the people who were being policed and in repression in quartier ouvrier, in the 17e, 18e, 19e, 20e, and 13e arrondissement. And so, we always had stuff to talk about, but he knew so much, had so much greater range than I did. And so often I felt that over in a wine and near Vichy or here in our house or in Balazouk, we ended up talking about topics that I knew something about, because a lot of things that he knew so much about, I don't know enough about to discuss in any intelligent way with him.
Earlier, you talked about how he wasn't interested just about representations, but about, as you put it, reality and representations. And of course, there's been a lot of debate about that question for many decades, especially in our field. But as I was rereading Biribi over the past week, I was struck by his analytical efforts to reckon with the sources, with sources that seem to provide access to the world and yet to keep him at a distance. And I thought that in this book, maybe more than others, although I'm sure other scholars may have read his work more carefully, that he lays bare almost like a methodological struggle, which is really our collective struggle. As we a kind of a reckoning with the mediated nature of the past, a problematization of these mediation on so many pages, very explicitly in the text, in his own voice. And in the Bas-Fond, I was struck by the capacious and precise vocabulary he summons to speak about language and rhetoric. He talks about les surgissements, les émergences, les récurrences, les acceptions, les inventions, les déclinaisons, les associations, les évocations, and I could go on. So there's a whole kind of semantic register to talk about evolutions of language and a precise precision in his own language. And in Biribi, there is that, but there's also what one feels, I felt, almost a hope, without illusions, perhaps, to approach also a social reality, experiences, emotions, suffering. He writes so much about also not just about the representation, but perhaps trying to get closer to the experience of suffering as well. And it's implicit also in the passage you chose, Mame. That quote from Georges Darien. I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts on that. Maybe we've said enough about it.
Just to leap in quickly, I mean, I think I really appreciated the quotation that Mame chose, and I think the way that the body moves to the center of the social imaginary in Dominique's work between the Biribi book and then Bas-Fond, which is all about the body, is very striking. And I think that when you're dealing with the body, this question of the relationship between representation and the there-ness of flesh is very pronounced. One thing that we haven't mentioned, he never really engaged in any systematic way in a critique of Foucault, but it's kind of at the edges of all of his work, right? It's all over the place, and the Biribi book, without actually saying so, is also a critique of Foucault, because after all, this is about disciplinary power. This is, the mutilation of laboring bodies. It's very clear that this is not consistent and knowingly inconsistent with the idea of surveillance and punishing power as articulated by Foucault when he talks about the enquête judiciaire. It's also true that he's aware that these technologies are very whimsical and imaginative and do not conform at all to the rhythms of things as they are described in Foucault. So I do think that there is an interesting, untheorized yet quite present critique of Foucault in.
These are great points. I think you're just sending me to my 10th reading of the book.
John?
Well, Stéphane, I thought in your question there were sort of two elements worth just mentioning, and then we kind of let them drop. And one was language, because he was so interested in the language and the changing use of language. And this is something that I got interested in, earlier, long before I knew Dominique, when I was working on the banlieue and the stigmatization of the banlieue. I was able to identify within, about 10 years when, by going back to old dictionaries and encyclopedias, going back to Littré, Diluvium, and all this, and you can see in reading the descriptions of Faubourg and banlieue that they begin to take on after 1848 a pejorative sense, and that a pejorative sense in the sense that, he doesn't speak very well, he speaks with a Faubourgian accent, and this kind of thing. And his language was very, very important to Kalifa. And the other is there's always, one thing that was part of, I guess, my conversation with Dominique and our readings of Dominique, and as part of, reading the historians that we read and the works that that we treasure and the works that we diss and don't like so much, is that, the archives. And he was someone interested in the police. And as you know, I was a student of Chuck Tilley, and I'm a compulsive maniac, and I worked in every single departmental archive in France. That was the way I wanted to, to find France, and I was working on other book projects, and that was comme ma fille dit, papa tu es maniaque. But I also have the advice of yet another late friend of mine, Richard Cobb, or the warnings, that he said you really can't trust archives because the police will write what they want their superiors to hear, and that's always kind of and I don't necessarily believe that, but Dominique, who worked on the Commissaire de Police also, and you just have to put everything in the context and in space and time, and space is very particularly important for me in the work that I've always done, because a lot of the books that I've written have to do with space. A lot are writing about cities like Nîmes or Reims or Perpignan or everywhere. I've written about Limoges, God forbid. I've written about most everything. But especially writing about Paris and the margins of city life. There's that word margins again. And so language and archives, and Kalifa worked in all sorts of different kinds of archives, were so important, to him. And so for young historians just starting out, or the people at the University of Texas, the graduate students posing him questions, those are the sorts of things that he talked about. And it's very important for for my particular formation, though I'm, older than, poor Dominique, who abandoned us at l'âge de 63 ans. But that was always something very important in my work, and it was important in Kalifa's work. And we did some work that was similar and did very different things. But voilà.
Thank you. Shifting gears a little bit as we move to the last segment of our conversation. Quentin Dulermoz and Thomas Dodman and Hervé Mazurel present Dominique in their essay as a passeur, and we've used that metaphor. It's come up already. Notably, Mame, when you were talking about his Dominique as a passeur between disciplines. But I think there's other ways we can think of him as a passeur, and let's talk about this a little bit. Well, John, you just mentioned students. He was also a passeur between generations. In their essay, Dulermoz, Dodman, and Mazurel write that Dominique oversaw a new generation of French 19e-istes. He directed 35 PhD theses, and 13 more were pending. And this is important, but he also did other forms of labor that were not, as visible, as rewarded. I know, having welcomed him at the IFS twice, I saw his generosity with students here, American, MA students, but also with MA students in Paris as well. And Miranda, you spoke in our conversation about what you termed his expansive sense of duty, and I think that this is also part of why we're here today. That there's the work, but there's also the place that he willingly occupied within an institutional world.
I think he understood himself as a bridge between the United States and France. And so people who were, interested, not necessarily going to become academics, really just put himself forward as the kind of shepherd. And I know, having talked to Sarah, who's not here, but I know Sarah Maza, that I know who would attest to this, that his seminar was a kind of landing pad for a lot of people who were otherwise flapping around in the city. And so basically he was this kind of cultural translator and also kind of shepherd of Americans abroad, to the point that it didn't really matter. I mean, hosting Sarah Maza clearly is, an honor, but still, I think that he had a sense that this was his role, and he did things that he really didn't have to do. His professional position made the amount of service that he did to the profession completely remarkable.
Also, he read everything. I mean, that's part of the whole idea of him being a passeur. I mean, he, you mentioned generation, Stéphane, and, Michel and Corbin, Alain Corbin. I mean, they're a very different generation. Michel, she's got 93 and she's still, still publishing, and Corbin's a slightly younger, but the same generation. But they were really the first to really read systematically, works written by American and British scholars. And Dominique, I mean, he read everything. He read everything. As I said, he gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning and reads and he writes, and oh, how we miss him, my gosh. But that's another important sense that Robin or somebody mentioned, and that you just eloquently put, Miranda, about sort of joining, crossing the Atlantic. And he was someone who liked to travel frenetically. He was always, sending me an email from Japan or from Brazil or God, he loved to travel. From Cuba, he sent me a picture of. He knows I have a weakness for rum, and he sent me a picture of him smoking a cigar. I have no weakness for cigars. He's sitting in front of an enormous bottle of rum in Havana, and that was part of it. But that was part of his learning about other places and other people and what folks are working on, and being interested in people. As I said, when he came to Balazouk, who didn't do anything with history at all, finding out what they're interested in. And that was what he just had. That's part of having just brilliant imagination, a sense of connecting, of making the bridge also not just cross the Atlantic, but between representations and reality. Yes, elle est bien.
That it's true what you're saying about him as a passeur between several generations, because I remember, when I was a graduate student, I sat in Alain Corbin's seminar, and I heard Alain Corbin talk, reading some scholars from the U.S. And elsewhere, and I feel that Dominique Kalifa, who succeeded Alain Corbin, took this to the next level, and there was even a greater presence of Americans, but certainly in the continuity of what already had been present. Mame, you said something that in our conversation that struck me. You said, "Je ne sais pas si la France sait que son œuvre a eu une ampleur internationale."
Yes, I mean, wow. So I speak here, for France and from France, but yeah, I don't think that that people here fully grasp what he means and what he's achieved. What he's built across the world, both for his name, for his legacy, and for the field of history, and also by a domino effect for all the disciplines that he influenced. He, like you say, John, he firstly ventured out of of his quartier latin and out of the comfort of the hexagon, and through bridges between foreign audiences and a French historiography whose influence abroad had declined, from the glorious day of the École. And I think that this is maybe where his most important legacy is, here in France, of course, but also in future classrooms at the Institute of French Studies at NYU, in seminars in Mexico City, in Adelaide, in Kyoto, Sao Paulo, Seoul, Moscow, Bologna. And, right now, French academia is going through a rough patch. Right? That's an understatement. But and in these times of, intellectual confinement, I think of his curiosity and and often wonder what he would have said, tweeted or wrote about the current event.
At the Sorbonne ceremony, I mean, you can read online the different speeches by various colleagues and friends of Dominique. And Jean-Yves Mollier said something that echoes what you just said. He said, inquiet sur l'avenir de cette institution universitaire, Dominique Kalifa était aussi sur le rôle des intellectuels, de plus en plus isolés dans un univers médiatique qui appartient désormais aux communicants et non plus aux savants. And to some degree, he modeled a form of intellectual being as a passeur in many ways. We talked about the transnational, we've talked about the transgenerational, but also even, between fields and between academic and non-academic forms of knowledge.
And even, it's something that I learned from him was that vulgarization is not vulgar. And I think that it's Andrea Goulet who spoke of him as a shapeshifter, right? He shapeshifted from one form to another to open to as many audiences as possible. And in that piece, you mentioned it earlier, Hervé Mazurel, Thomas Dodman, and Quentin Delormeuse highlighted the extraordinary bridges he built between academia and the outside world during his, through his 30 years stint with Libération. And the public intellectual transmission also happened through his film. I just watched Paris Romantique, Paris Erotique. It came on TV last week. His activity on social media, on Twitter, and his surprising foray into theater. So yeah, he told us that you could allow yourself to be a voyageur, a flâneur, a déambulateur, as you nicely put it, an enquêteur, a raconteur, find pleasure in reading and be generous and all that, you could do all that and be successful in academia and be generous with knowledge.
Anybody want to add anything about Dominique as a passeur in any other way that we haven't mentioned so far?
Well, it's these days, presses are not eager to do translations. In this country, when I've proposed various books to be translated into English, I always say, well, those people that want to read the book know French and they can read it anyway. And it's extremely hard to get, books translated, written by French historians into the U.S. But with Dominique, it was always easier because his books had such a, are so readable. And they Buffon, I think, did pretty well when it was translated. And as I already said, his book on l'histoire de la Belle Époque is coming out, and I think he might have another one translated as well. I don't think Birubis has been translated, but that was part of being a passeur. Was he has had increased this kind of international reputation, and in the United States, historians do not have the public visibility that historians do in France. I mean, Dominique must have, I already said, he probably reviewed 100 books in Libé, and Michel did probably that many as well. And occasionally a random historian, my very good friend David Bell, reviews a lot in The Nation or in the New York Review of Books. But basically the newspapers that used to have book review sections, I used to review for the Boston Globe, and then now they just review books on feeling better about yourself or how to fix your computer and goddamn things like that. And so there's very little public presence of historians in this country. And it was people like Kalifa, and Michel who kept the torch going in France. And it's a different world.
As this conversation comes to a close, and we'll try to keep it relatively short. I mean, people have limited attention spans, that we all do these days. But is there anything that we haven't said that you think needs to be said about Dominique as a scholar, as a historian, as a person at Passau? Or perhaps go ahead. Yes, ma'am.
I mean, I think it might have been mentioned, but I just wanted to add that to me he is a sensible historian in the literal sense of someone who works with his five senses and someone who makes you mobilize your five senses around his work and around his presence. And I often speak of him in the present because in the wall of tradition, and as it was beautifully laid out by Senegalese poet Birago Diop in his work Souffle, the departed are not dead as long as they live in our imaginary and as long as we acknowledge their presence around us. And I believe that through our personal and professional memories of him, through the way his voice and his voices, as you said in your piece, Stéphane, his writings continue to touch us and continue to engage in dialogues with, generation of scholars who might not even be born yet. I believe that he's still alive.
He's still there for his students, his colleagues, and his friends. And, when you read Dominique, it always, makes you want to ask the even more broad questions, read more, research more, and write more. And that was, that is a lasting contribution of our Notre Ami Disparu.
It's difficult to conclude the conversation, but as I was thinking about how to end it, I was thinking of his last book, Les Noms d'Époque, and Vinnie Dada and Willis Silverman co-wrote a beautiful essay to the forum about the concept. And I was struck in the epilogue with a quotation. Dominique quotes a letter from Gide to Walter Benjamin. Ce n'est qu'en quittant une chose que nous la nommons, Gide wrote. And I guess the same could be true of people, right? We name them as we take leave, but I don't think this was the case today. I don't think it could be. I don't think that we could name Dominique, because naming to some extent is about delimiting, about narrowing, about fixing down. And I think that our conversation has shown the opposite, that a historiography that is anchored in l'écoute, in curiosity for others, in rigor and playful performance, opens up new expanses, that it remains in constant movement, open to the fluctuations of history and to our own fluctuating relationships with the dead as historians. And so, Mame, you mentioned his voice. And so let me end with Dominique's voice and the beautiful, haunting words that conclude the epilogue and the book. And I wish he could be the one reading it, but I'll read this passage. That's short. Considérez le passé pour ce qu'il est, une réalité mobile, changeante, historique, travaillée par les hommes et les femmes qui l'ont habité, mais aussi par les regards, les lectures ou les déplacements que les époques ultérieures lui ont fait subir. C'est admettre que l'on n'écrit jamais que dans cet enchevêtrement rhapsodique et presque kaléidoscopique de temporalité qui est constitutif de l'histoire. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mame. Thank you, Miranda.
Merci tout le monde. Au revoir.
À bientôt.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
À plus. Merci, Stéphane.
Merci Stéphane. Et merci à tout le monde. Et merci Dominique. L'histoire continue.
Surtout.